Hello to communication and technology. Today we have a theoretical lesson rather than historical. We concentrate on two main concepts in the philosophy of technology that are very much tied to what we were discussing last section, with the rise of real communication technologies, namely the printing press. I mentioned that neither paper nor the printing press with the movable type was an invention of European ingenuity. It was rather first invented in the Far East, in China, in Korea, and then much earlier even deployed in Japan than anywhere in Europe. And second, I mean, what we will discuss today also, it is highly debatable if there is something like ingenuity behind an invention like that in the first place, or rather, as Newton would have said, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and these giants, of course, are not people. They are all of the inventions that humanity has made before us. Well, this is already what we mean by progress. So, progress is a Latin word and means to move forward. And it means that we have a concept of the past, of something that had happened before. One of the really striking things in visiting these caves with the cave paintings in France for me was that some of the paintings um, were redone 5,000 years after they had initially been painted. So imagine some painter makes these beautiful drawings, these deer and buffaloes in that cave, and people go visit and see that not only a few years later, still a few hundred years later, still, but 5,000 years later, someone comes and says, actually, we need more horses on that wall. But that's actually what happened. So there were a few horses in the one wall, and then 5,000 years later, someone painted more horses in the same style. How do we know that 5,000 years had passed? Well, you can use so called carbon dating to assess the age of Sud. This is due to the natural occurrence of radioactive isotopes in carbohydrates. So the percentage of carbon is naturally radioactive by the ultraviolet radiation that comes into the atmosphere. A continuous change in the isotopic mix in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere happens. And plants who photosynthesize bind carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and thus have a few atoms here and there of this radioactive isotope. But when the plant dies, or I mean, for example, a tree is cut, that stops, of course. And the carbon over the years, the centuries, the millennia decays. And since we know exactly how quickly carbon isotopes decay, we can see when this plant was no longer alive. And this is exactly how we can date these thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of years old paintings. And now is the interesting fact that I mentioned. It is scientifically clear that these cave paintings have been used for like thousands of years. I mean, clearly, there was no concept at that time. You can see that from the style that was still the same, no concept of fashion, of change in style. People didn't have history because they only had stories that they would orally tell. So the invention of history is really a remarkable point in time that comes with writing. And progress means that we have a concept that something lies behind us. And then, of course, the next step to think of is something will lie before us. And the question is that what lies before us any different from what we have already experienced? Is there anything to expect from the future? Anything that we will have not yet experienced in the past? And depending on where you come from, the answer to this question might come out very differently. So there's religions and philosophies that tell you that we have kind of a cyclical history, that things kind of stay the same, even if once in a time they seem better or worse. This is, of course, in particularly true when you think of reincarnation of the bodily life, so that you die and get reborn in another body. The idea of progress hardly makes any sense because, I mean, you die and you come back. Progress is only if you can finally leave this cycle. In other religions, however, there is some messianic event in the end. And I mean, Europe and the Middle East likewise has over a long time been dominated by religions that are very strongly believing in that. So let's see how that played out over time. Well, even in Europe, thinking of the future as something good is not always how people saw the time. So this painting is by Lucas Cranach the Elder. It shows the golden age. So the picture is an illustration of Ovid's Metamorphosis, one of the most beautiful Latin sets of poems that describes the history of the world, in particular, of course, the story of all the gods and their love and wars and so on, as a narrative of continuous changes. So everything gets changed into something else. And the world begins, of course, with creation in the antique myth. This is the age of the Titans, and everything is kind of in chaos. That is the world before there was cosmos. So chaos means unorder, and cosmos means order. And this is the beginning of the world. And then with cosmos comes the golden age. So golden was that first age, which compared to no other, no threatening words could be read cast in bronze. The mortals knew no shores besides their own. Not yet were cities surrounded by steep moats. There were no trumpets of straight or horns of curved brass. There were no helmets and no swords. I mean, this is a very strong idea that the past was much better than the present. I mean, first of all, communication technology is not seen as something positive by Ovid. I mean, the threatening words could be read in bronze. I mean, that refers, of course, to law. We remember the Codex Hammurabi and this horrible women's law of the later Assyrians. I mean, that is cast in bronze or stone injustice. And I mean, many of the laws of the ancients were quite draconic. I mean, in fact, the word draconic for a brutal and unjust law comes from the Greek politician Drakon, who is credited for coming up with the first ever written down constitution of Athens, which actually was not that draconic after all, if you read it nowadays. But for the contemporaries, it was kind of very disconcerting. So, and clearly travel was not seen as something positive because it was pointed out that it is great golden age. The mortals, we would not know any foreign shores. No one had set sail to other countries. I mean, this is the paradise as Cranach here depicts. I mean, of course, Ovid, I mean, that is pre-Christian times, had probably not much knowledge of the Judo-Christian Muslim idea of a paradise. I mean, he has the idea of the paradise of the Romans, but nevertheless, it is a golden age in the past. Everything was good then. It is no longer that good now. No swords, no helmets, and no trumpets to be signs of war. The same, of course, we have in our scriptures. So this engraving shows King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and the prophet Daniel. And Daniel gets told the dream by Nebuchadnezzar, a dream that Nebuchadnezzar finds very uneasy. And the dream goes as follows. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Well, I mean, Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's vision is very well known. So this statue, Daniel tells, is history. It is the course of history that starts with the golden age, the golden head, and then the paradise of this golden age deteriorates epoch after epoch until everything is only clay, only dirt. And that is the time when a messianic event strikes. And later generations, of course, would interpret that as the moment of revolution. This is when the workers stand up and finally turn history from the head to its feet, as Marx would say, and bring this kind of glorious end of history to humankind. Well, this was the idea of history before modernity in the West. And you can see clearly that the idea of progress was not positive. It was seen as a continuous decline. And that is really interesting if you think of progress now. I mean, we think of progress as something usually positive. I mean, in particular, if you look around in the UAE, I mean, the UAE, I mean, even at the age of today's living people's grandparents, was a country that was very barren and incredibly hard to live in. It was always troubled by war. It was under threat from many parts of the world at these crossroads. I mean, there were many interests playing out, in particular in the 20th century after the First World War. And so the past, I mean, if you ask people here, if you talk to them, I mean, you know, if you are from this region and talk to your grandparents, is usually not seen as something great. There was, of course, great things. I mean, the Bedouin life, I mean, had its merits. I mean, like heroic deeds, crossing the empty quarter and things like that, that tell a story of hardship and endeavor. However, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, having nice cities like Abu Dhabi or Dubai and having a climatized shopping mall and just turning on the faucet and getting drinkable water out of it, I mean, has its merits. I mean, that has something for it. And so clearly the idea that progress is positive is, I would say, still not unreasonable to be here. So the progress in, say, let's say in the last 250 years is clearly a progress that's very strongly tied with technology. So this is an engraving from a newspaper. It is a very famous engraving. I took that from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I mean, clearly, it shows all the blessings that people in the 19th century here in 1876, so about 150 years ago, would earn from technology. So we have clearly a steam-powered world. There's the steam engine in the back, the railroad. There is the steamboat on the river. There is steam-powered tools in the mill in the background that make work so much easier. And then, of course, the telegraph, one of the first electro technical devices, the telegraph that would make communication over the country so much easier compared to carrying letters back and forth. So Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal and one of the driving forces behind Facebook, a billionaire investor, most notoriously also co-founder of Palantir, this surveillance company. So he writes in his book From Zero to One, our ancestors lived in a static, zero-sum society where success meant seizing things from others. Then, after 10,000 years of fitful advance from primitive agriculture to medieval windmills, the modern world suddenly experienced relentless technological progress from the advent of the steam engine in the 1760s all the way up to about 1970. So 1970 was the year where I was born, and I think he was born there too, is the year when progress ends, obviously, but the 250 years before that were relentless technological progress. So let's deconstruct this statement a bit. So first of all, who is Peter Thiel? I mentioned that he is a very successful investor. Seeing Facebook early on as this disruptive company that would indeed become this one of the most valuable corporations in the world, is a venturous investment. And so this is venture capital. Venture capital is defined by investing money into things that might or might not be successful, but the odds are clearly against it. So Peter Thiel describes himself as a contrarian, as someone who always looks into positions that very few people agree with. And he says Facebook was seen as something that would never work, but he would still think, actually, it might make sense. And I think you can give him credit for that, despite the difficulties that I find in many of the things that I hear or read about him. Seeing things that actually have an economic potential, where you can actually earn money from, or where you can't. A typical thing that you can compare, for example, is the invention of the plane around 1900 by the Wright brothers in the US. And then a bit later, the invention of the rocket belt that would carry a person with a gyroscope a few meters above ground. That was, I think, first shown successfully in 1962. So why do we not have flying cars? Why do we not have these rocket belts that make us fly around? But we have planes, obviously. Well, the reason is that the fuel that the rocket belt needs is more than a liter of fuel per second. And to fly 5 seconds, you need 5 liters. To fly half a minute, you need 30 liters. So more than 30 seconds of flight will just never be possible. Otherwise, the thing is just too heavy. While a plane, you know that there is gliders. The plane might actually just fly by itself if there is enough wind. So this makes the plane really a different invention from the rocket belt. And it is not stupid to think of people being able to see that early on and others don't. And that makes a good investor, I think. A good investor is a person who early on sees these potentials in technology that actually can achieve its economic value while others can't. And you might still be wrong. So this is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's book, From Zero to One, is an interesting book because he says globalization is basically just copying what worked on a small scale worldwide. So you have an invention that works, for example, in Germany, and then you just mass produce it so that everyone in the world can benefit from it. And in particular, if you can mass produce it in a low wage country, in sweatshops or so, then you get even more advantage from the economies of scale. So, and that, he says, is not interesting. That is not really what we mean by technological progress. We think of these inventions that actually change the world. And the examples that are always given is the printing press and the steam engine. And I mean, of course, there is undoubtedly the case that the steam engine really did a lot of things in the world and changed a lot. But the question is, why? Why did it actually happen? Was the steam engine the driver, or was society, the population density, the climate, and other factors outside the technology already there to make it possible? The same, of course, is true for the printing press. I mean, that the printing press was such a success in Europe at its time, of course, had to do with the already dwindling power of the churches, as mentioned last time. I mean, you can print only so many church-related things. I mean, if everybody has a Bible then in their shelves, I mean, who needs a second one? But if you can print anything, any kind of ephemeral and accidental literature, and everything is suddenly available in print that you can think of, I mean, that only works in a world where people find that meaningful, in a world beyond feudalism or the reign of the church. And so it is not as straightforward that progress comes in these steps, as Peter Thiel would say, from 0 to 1. So the quote here, that our ancestors lived in this static zero-sum societies where success meant seizing things from others, this is an interesting claim, because actually I think that is basically true. Until very recently, I mean, maybe 500 years ago or so, most of the wealth that people could get for themselves was by taking it from others. So if you look into pre-industrial economy, it is always an economy of exploitation. The question is just now, has that changed? And we will discuss that a bit later when we look into the post-colonial deconstruction of the ideas of progress and technology. But for now, I think it's a fair quote to say that the steam engine actually made it possible to have this huge increase in productivity, so that the same person, for example, in the same blacksmith who could make maybe one pot every 2 days, could suddenly make 100 pots per hour. I mean, that is just orders of magnitude more. And by producing so much more productively, so much more efficiently, and now comes Marx's idea, that frees how the people who have machines at their hand can use their spare time. So if you have these tools at hand, like the steam engine, like a steam-powered workshop, you can concentrate and use the money that you earn, the surplus that you earn now, for investing it into more machines, into research and development for better machines. And this is what Marx says, the beginning of capitalism. So the famous quote by Karl Marx is, "The hand mill brought us feudalism. The steam-powered mill brought us capitalism." The thinking behind that is that the technology defines the economic superstructure in which people find themselves in their time. And this, I think, is the basic question that we will follow through this lecture today. Is that true? And to what extent do you argue that way? So this Peter Thiel quote is, I think, the peak of techno-optimism, of thinking that technology is the actual driver of humans' progress into a glorious future. Why does he think the 1970s bring an end to it? Well, he sees that after like 1970, nothing useful was invented anymore. That seems a bit conservative for my taste, because why would that actually happening? But I didn't want to cut the quote without giving it in full to you, so you can make your own judgment on it. One of the most famous depictions of progress is this, unbelievable painting called Manifest Destiny. It was painted in 1872 by the otherwise not very well known artist John Gust. So, and what you see here is really unbelievable. You see progress. This is this angel-like woman in not really a dress, flying through the air with a telegraph line in her hand. And behind her comes the track of pioneer settlers, of pioneer colonialists settling and colonizing North America. And behind the Conestoga wagon of the first settlers in the early 19th century comes the post, the mail coach driven by 6 horses, and behind that you see the railroad, and in the mist on the horizon, I mean, you see the Hudson River in Manhattan, and between Manhattan and Brooklyn, you see the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge at its time was the largest building in the world. The towers of the Brooklyn Bridge were also one of the highest structures that humankind had built so far. It was for a long time, I think until the building of the Chrysler Building. So for like 50 years, also the tallest building in the United States. So building the Brooklyn Bridge across the East River, connecting these two thriving and big cities, Brooklyn and Manhattan, clearly marked history, a pivotal point in history for the people living in America at that time. For the first time, people would not need to go on a ferry and get shipped over the East River, which took a painful amount of time, and depending on the weather, was not even possible many days of the year. It was not possible at night. It was dangerous. Many ships sunk, people drowned, and suddenly there was this bridge. This bridge is there still to this day. It is a beautiful structure. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of engineering and design. So it's the Brooklyn Bridge as this mark of progress, and then come the railroads, and of course agriculture in the down corner here. However, I mean, you see the victims of progress as well. I mean, you see the Native Americans, the First Nation people. They have no chance. They get just chased away. I mean, that is just, probably was seen as something positive at that time, but of course we know what that means. I mean, the spirit of frontier. So the frontier was the idea, in the 19th century, that you would have kind of this truce fire, this peace treaty between the European settlers and the First Nation people in the America. And that they would have their territory, even if they would already been chased away from the East Coast, and then out of the so-called Ohio territories, in a way, people said, well, and that's enough now. I mean, they can keep the West. But of course, we know that history played out differently for the American Indians. The Native Americans was just pushed and pushed and pushed and drove almost to extinction, put now into reservations where they can barely survive. And with them, of course, went away the bison, the buffalo, that roamed the prairie in great numbers and which was hunted to extinction in a very short time to take away the economic basis of the life of the First Nation people. So, and you see that the bison and the Native Americans, uh, they are pushed into the darkness. They are, they are vanishing into obscurity. While this angel, kind of the spirit of Columbia, as it was also called, this Columbian spirit, this American endeavor, the Western, the European superiority, brings light over this dark continent. Yeah, this is technology and progress as Western people used to see it until very recently, of course. Yeah, very recently, we will. There's a painting by Klee named Angelus Novus. This is how Walter Benjamin starts his musing about the philosophy of history, number 9. That is a collection of 15 small texts that Benjamin wrote in 1935, thinking through the ideas of progress and the drivers of history and criticizing Hegel and Marx for their optimism. So if you compare this picture, Angelus Novus, with the Colombian beautiful woman flying across the sky, the difference is striking. Klee gave this picture, this water painting, to his friend Walter Benjamin shortly before Benjamin had to leave Germany to go into exile in France, from where he was chased further over the Pyrenees into Spain, where he took his life, as I mentioned yesterday. So there is a painting by Klee named Angelus Novus. Depicted is an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something at which he is staring. His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. The angel of history must look like this. His face is turned towards the past. Where a chain of events appears before us, he sees a single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. He would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise, and it has caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The end of progress in the 20th century were brought by three connected events that would not only strike the West. The first, of course, is the two great wars, the First World War from 1914 to 1918, and the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. These two wars were perceived as war at industrial scale. So they were technological wars, and they were so horrible that people did have no comprehension of how to describe what was happening. The second thing that Benjamin only was partly aware of, but shortly after he took his life, became known um, to the people outside Germany, was of course the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the single moment of collapse of civilization. It is really unimaginable to think of people of education, people of intellect, in a country that was rich, in a country that was pretty egalitarian, as Germany was, that people would become so cruel and so hateful to commit the most horrible genocide that ever happened in history and is unprecedented and has never been followed afterwards. So, this is a singular event in history, together with the two wars, mark a total disaster, the total end of what was seen as progress. Because what value has progress if the only thing you get out of it is to kill people more efficiently? And the third, I mean, not totally unconnected. I mean, after the two wars brought so much destruction to Europe, also to the colonial powers, they could no longer maintain their cruel rule about the plunder of the world that they had amassed. So the major colonial powers, part by part, had to give up their colonial empires. And decolonization, of course, gave space to people in the colonies, in the former colonies, to say, is that actually true that all inventions of rank have been made by Europeans or US inventors? Wasn't there also things that were meaningful made in other parts of the world? And these are the three things that are really worth looking at to deconstruct the idea of progress in Western technology. Well, decolonization, in particular in our setup here in Abu Dhabi, I think is still the most fruitful, because it is not only that you say things are horrible and we really must deconstruct them, but decolonization and post-colonial thought offers us to open up our minds that were nailed shut, boarded, to see how rich the world actually is with different perspectives, and how stupid this idea of linear progress made in Europe or the US is actually. So decolonization, of course, I mean, is a post-colonial philosophy, is a strong, I mean, deconstruction and criticism of progress, in the sense that progress was used by the European powers to tell the colonial people, you know what, you are just primitives, you don't have the right technology, but we do, and we bring it to you because we are nice. We bring you writing, we bring you Christianity and whatever else of our blessings, and make you into proper humans. So no longer just barbarians. I mean, of course, this is all not true. I mean, this is exactly a kind of an apology for actually just conquering other parts of the world and subjecting people under an unjust rule and exploiting what they have and enslaving them. And there is a lot of writing done about that that is really worth reading. I mean, I've put some of the examples here. I mean, of course, the most famous is Edward Said's Orientalism and the scholarship that followed out of it. The post-colonial view, together with the collapse of the most technocratic regime in the world, the Soviet Union, also gives, of course, the idea that the whole concept of history might actually be flawed. It's not so much what I would endorse now, but Francis Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history has some interesting arguments for it. So Fukuyama, as you can read here, argues that this idea of continuous progress in society that is driven by technology and capitalism comes to a natural halt at the moment when the whole world is capitalist. And while Fukuyama is now blamed for being kind of uncritically in favor of capitalism, actually the context of his argument is quite critical. And he says, I mean, of course, history doesn't end. It is just our history, the Western history, that ends with that. And it's better now than later that we acknowledge that. That this universal Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government has prevailed worldwide. And you know what? It might not be what other people had been asking for. This is, however, of course, a very difficult discussion. I mean, is that really the case? I would really like to hear all your thoughts on that. I mean, um, I personally, of course, am quite in favor of understanding technology not only as something horrible. I mean, I'm totally in favor of the idea of progress on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, I mean, most of the time, progress was just the progress of the few people who would own. The capitalist, the colonial lords, whoever was in power could use progress to get more power out of it. So there's always these, I mean, it is a dialectical process here. Um, and this endorsement, on the one hand, a totally uncritical endorsement of the ideology of Western global universal democracy and capitalism as the final form of human government, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the condemnation as that it's totally arbitrary. That we see in post-colonial, post-modernism. So to say that the idea of democracy is just oppression of the West is just another tool of colonialism in disguise. So I think it is worthwhile to negotiate between these two positions, although that is, of course, not an easy task, in particular if you come from a part of the world where the blessings of Western democracy were always tied into colonial. Besides progress, there's another concept that's closely related, which is that history is predestined, that it is determined. What does that mean, determined? The idea behind determinism is that events in the past define what's lying ahead of us. I mean, that can be religiously thought of, that there is fate. The world has been created in a certain way that we have no chance but following our destiny. It can also be in a physical sense, as the famous mathematician and inventor of modern probability theory, Pierre-Simon de Laplace, would place it, that the creation of the world follows kind of this physical rule of a clockwork. This is the Newtonian idea. So if I know all the causes, I can determine the effect. Well, determinism, I mean, is a very strong narrative in its own right. So if something is determined, there's very little to be done about it. It takes away a lot of agency if we think that things are driven by external forces. And technology determinism is, of course, in particular in our field of concern, because if you think that technology defines what we do with it, that technology is the driving force of what creativity can do with it, then of course interactive media becomes a rather boring field of activity. Interactive media is just kind of a consequence of what technology wants. So the idea of determinism is, of course, not restricted on technology. There's a lot of other scientific determinisms around. Very strong, I mean, over the last, I would say, 30 years, was also the biological or genetic determinism. This is very similar to the determinism that we will discuss here. So Richard Dawkins famous or infamous author of a book called The Selfish Gene in 1976, claims that people are robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve selfish molecules known as genes. So this is the idea. The matter that we carry, our physical presence, defines what we do. We have no agency over it. So, and technological determinism is this claim that the technology causes the structure and the rest of society and culture. So it is not society and culture that shapes technology, and the technology only is there because there is an economic and social reason for it to exist. But it's the other way around. Someone makes a technological invention and then society changes. This is technological determinism. And the second claim is that technology is autonomous. So autonomous technology means that technology is not in human control. It has its own logic as if it would be alive. So these are two narratives that were very strong during the 20th century in particular. So the people would think, if I invent something that is useful, then it will just be driven through society. And there is a lot of criticism to that, but I mean, as there is endorsement. And one of the silliest that I could find was this book by Kevin Kelly. I mean, Kevin Kelly is really not a stupid person. I really like him. I mean, he is a great journalist and a very warm and nice person. So when I read this book that I think he published exactly 10 years ago, I couldn't believe the naivete that he would put into it, as if technology would want anything. I mean, technology is not alive. Technology can't desire. It is people who want something for their technology, and this is how it works. But Kevin Kelly really, in all earnesty, says that technology drives the world and is kind of alive on its own and wants things, and we are there to serve it. So what is that about? I mean, of course, I mean, there is something to say in favor of that. I mean, clearly, I mean, you can't deny that the world in which we live now is also shaped by, for example, digital technology. I mean, the internet really changes the world. And we will look into that when we come to social media and to digital media and how it literally kicks off unrest and revolutions. I mean, also, of course, television as the major medium of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War and all its cultural fights are inseparable from television and the dominance of Hollywood as the cultural production industry. The printing press, of course, I mean, we've discussed that. I mean, of course, book production is not meaningless. It is totally meaningful that suddenly people could have this production of information industrial. So it is really important to understand that, of course, technology shapes the world. It is not the primary driving force. It is not technology that wants. It is people behind the technology who want. And maybe you find the time, it is in the reading, to look into Winner's text, why technology is political. And of course, also the criticism of this text. You find it in the further readings in the syllabus. So Winner looked into the work of Robert Moses, one of the city planners of modern New York in the 20th century. And Robert Moses was not only a very modern person, a believer in the car-friendly city, he was also a horrible racist. And so he would kind of co-engineer the car-friendly city with big highways that would lead into it, with kind of pushing away communities of people of color. And Winner analyzes that and sees how Robert Moses orders the bridges of highways to be built lower than the height of the public buses. so that people who would not own a car could not leave into the suburbs, so that people in the suburbs, in particular on the coastline of Long Island, would be undisturbed by working class people. And I mean, if you believe into individual traffic and think that law of public transport, I mean, that is really a very cruel method of achieving your goal of racial segregation. It's the opposite of building fast underground lines, fast public transport. This is, of course, a very serious, I would say, point to keep in mind if you look around here. I mean, clearly, building the metro in Dubai is a great benefit to the people who live and work there. And I only hope that more technology like that will be given to the people who live and work in the UAE, in other places too. So we have technology as a human tool, but also, of course, when it's there, it shapes things. And you decide as a capitalist which technology you deploy. This is the second argument that Winner makes in his text. This is the argument how motorized harvesting machines were first introduced in California in the mid 20th century. So these machines were clearly inferior to the laborers on the farms. So why did the landowners invest into these machines and replace the farmers with them? The reason is very simple. These machines were used to de-unionize the farm labor. So suddenly, farm laborers could be pushed out of the labor market and would see their labor as a commodity, really in the strict Marxian sense, that they had to negotiate instead of being strong and demanding towards the landowners. So this is Winner's argument. Technology is political, and it is in a way a technological determinist argument, because it says that technology, once introduced, shapes society in a way that can even be intentional, that you have these tools that you can use to create a society that is oppressive, that serves your own goals of, for example, capitalist exploitation or racist segregation. There is, however, the criticism of that view in a second article, and I really recommend that you read that too, by Volga and others, who say, actually, if you look closely into the story about Robert Moses, I mean, Moses was a horrible person. There's no debate about that. However, if the bridge were actually built that way, is really hard to find out. And actually, that's true, because I tried to look into that and I couldn't see that. So I don't know how Winner came up with it, and I couldn't find any proof for the either or the other argument. So it is really an interesting debate if the bridges actually were behind pushing people of color out of the desirable places in New York. One of the strongest advocates for technology as a driver of culture and the changer of society is Herbert Marshall McLuhan. So McLuhan, I mean, we frequently come across in interactive media because he is, so to say, he can be really seen as kind of this founding philosopher of interactive media. So McLuhan is very pessimistic about technology. I mean, he sees technological progress as something that is not desirable. He's a man of words. He's a man of print. He loves books. He's a literature scholar. So for him, print is something that's good. And the effect that print had on culture is something that he values highly. Nevertheless, what he sees and formulates in his seminal book, Understanding Media, is that print, in turning the vernacular into mass media or closed systems, created the uniform centralizing forces of modern nationalism. So what McLuhan argues is that in archaic society, communication is oral. They only have words. Everything has to be memorized and handed down verbally. So chanting, poetry, song, and rhythm help people remember long epics. And we discussed that. I'm, by the way, quoting McLuhan verbatim here. So that is, of course, true. In pre-writing times, people had only their memory, and so they better find a way that keeps it easy to memorize. And rhyming, making a poem and making a song of it, is, of course, a tool for that. With writing, this is no longer necessary. Now, McLuhan again. Writing is visual, not oral. Reading is private, not communal, like recitation. So, from the myths that were sung by bards to literature created by authors, this is the turn of literature, and that becomes the so called linguistic turn. This is a term that people coined that happened when print finally matured into mass literature, mass literacy, that everyone basically could learn to read and write and benefit from the blessings of information technology. So the multiple copies of the same book, of the same pamphlet in cheap printing would indeed free literature from the expert, from the elites of the monastery. And in that respect, and that is what McLuhan here claims, is that with printing the Bible and distributing it to the masses, priests would no longer have the monopoly on faith, and this would cause the Reformation. That would give Luther the chance to have the Reformation. I mean, of course, this is totally Eurocentric. The Reformation only happened in Germany and then in a few other countries across Europe. And I mean, of course, it is a drive of colonialism if you think of the United States now as a major country that is secular, but I mean, basically Protestant. So this is, again, that is totally Western. I mean, that has nothing to do with how things turned out in China, for example, or in India. I mean, history there is totally different. So we can't just claim that print turned the world in the way that, I mean, even how much I like McLuhan, this is just plainly wrong. There were, of course, other forces behind that are much stronger. We mentioned that already. That is colonialism. Colonialism was on its way already. I mean, it was on its way much earlier than print became a major thing in the 16th century in Europe. That just coincided. And it coincided for a reason, because society had changed at that time. There was a lot going on. It has to do with climate change. I mean, the climate had changed slowly over 500 years. It has to do with reopening the trade routes towards the east during the Crusades. I mean, that is a cruel thing to say, but I mean, in a way, I mean, that was what brought Europe back into history. I mean, Europe was basically closed off in their kind of tribal illiterate society over centuries, and then with the Crusades, suddenly they became connected to a world in the East, here in the Middle East, or further to the east along the Silk Road, that had a culture that was far beyond what they had, and that would, of course, revitalize society in Europe. That had nothing to do with technology; it was just there, and by that, people were suddenly knowing what to do with the invention of print. They had a purpose for it because they were suddenly merchants and no longer peasants. So this is really different. It is a cultural construct. I give you an example of how to kind of read technology in these two ways. So, like in the 19th century, an invention that was allegedly made by Leibniz and Pascal, two very famous mathematicians of the Baroque age, the sprout wheel, turned into an industry to produce computers. These mechanical computers, in the front, you see the Brunswiga. That was the most common calculating machine around 1900. And until I would say the 1950s, they stayed in business. Is a great fine mechanical device. You turn the crank and can add and subtract and multiply and divide. And the question is, why did it so long? Why didn't earlier generations use it already? Thinking that it took like 150 years between Pascal or Leibniz with the invention of the sprout wheel calculator for people in the 19th century actually seeing its value. Well, there's an easy answer to that. Metallurgy and fine mechanics were just not there. So the people could make these things of brass and bronzen materials, but they were not as stable, so they would always get stuck. And then in the 19th century, finally, you have this celebration of the sprout wheel with Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage is this legendary inventor of computer, together with Ada Byron King, the Countess of Lovelace. Ada Byron is the daughter of Lord Byron, the famous romantic poet and major figure in the Gothic Romanticism in the 19th century. Great writer and friend of Mary Shelley, and a romantic figure for losing his life in the Battle of Independence in Greece and so on. And so his daughter was totally kind of in that field, and her mother was really afraid that her daughter would come after her father, and so denied Ada any dealing with literature and the humanities, and forced mathematics and physics onto her daughter. And Ada Byron was clearly a very good scholar in that, so she became very apt in mathematics. She was a great driver behind the developing measure theory and probability theory, and as a co-worker came up probably with what you could call the first programming language. And so this is the analytical engine that Babbage built in the 1850s. It is really ingenious machine of sprout wheels and cranks that do elaborate calculations. And Babbage even envisioned a much bigger of these machines, the so-called difference engines, which has not been built until the 1990s, and is as well in the display of the Museum of Science and Technology in London. So this beautiful machine is kind of seems to prove the point that technology could just not be there before, because the fine mechanics, the tools were not right there. However, if you look into history, that's actually not true. So you see that in times about 2,500 years ago, in the Mediterranean Sea, this shipwreck in outside the city of Antikythera in Greece was salvaged, and aboard people found this remarkable piece of mechanics. It is a computer. It is a computer that is at least as sophisticated as the things that Babbage or Leibniz would build 2,000 years earlier. And still, no one used it at that time. Why is that? It is really an interesting question. There's more arguments to say like that. For example, the steam engine. For the steam engine, people put the same argument forward, that the steam engine could not be invented before the 18th century because the production of boilers that would withstand the huge pressure of the steam, so the boiler and the pistons and all the pressurized parts would just be blown apart. So it needed the invention of steel to come up with the steam engine. This is the narrative. However, if you look back more than 2,000 years, there was a steam engine in Alexandria. It was used to power opening and closing doors. It was just never used to drive mills. So it must be something else that drives history here. It can't be that the technology is invented and then has its own life. Both these technologies are good examples that having the technology on its own doesn't help much if no one understands what to do with it, if time is not ripe. A really funny or tragic um, anecdote on technological determinism is the story of Alfred Nobel. So Alfred Nobel is the famous or infamous inventor of dynamite. So dynamite uses an explosive, nitroglycerin, which is extremely sensitive to any kind of shock. So if you drop a tiny drop of nitroglycerin, that already causes a major explosion. So nitroglycerin was super dangerous to use in the mines. I mean, it killed many workers until the invention of dynamite through Alfred Nobel. So Nobel was a Swedish citizen and became insanely rich by his invention. However, not so much by mining, but another application of dynamite, weapons. So with dynamite, you could build explosives like the hand grenade or big cannons that would not just go off because there's a spark somewhere, that could be meaningfully targeted for explosion. You could build huge mines that would explode in the sea after drifting there for days or weeks. So Alfred Nobel, around the year 1900, was rightfully seen as kind of the inventor of this industrial warfare. And when his brother died, the leading French newspaper, Le Figaro, took it wrong and thought it was Alfred and not his brother who died, and wrote this obituary about him that clearly says, a man died who was not a good man. And Nobel read that, and from there, I mean, his diary note on that is even darker. So he must have had a second obituary that read that he was the merchant of death. Why would people say that? Because they think technology, the invention of dynamite, caused the war. And that is, of course, not true. War was there before. So it is not dynamite causing the war, although it is undeniable that Nobel profited from it. Of course, Nobel is a profiteer, but he is not the cause for all the pain. That is other people causing the wars for which Nobel delivered the material. So this is a tricky argument, of course, because it is also used by people in favor of loose gun control. They say, well, it's not gun that kills people, it is people killing people. And of course, in a way, that is true. But on the other hand, if you don't have it, if you don't have a gun, then you would probably not get one despite the regulation. And I believe in regulation. I believe that it is very important to keep in mind that these inventions, although not driving history, of course are tools for people to commit horrible things And so better keep things controlled. Don't give in. Don't give up agency and say, well, technology just takes its course. That is not true. One last example is more to my actual field of work, which is media and advertising. So in 1913, right before the start of First World War, the editor of a small German newspaper in Nuremberg, Wolfgang Riepe, would formulate his law that once media technology is in the world, it will never go away again. And here you see the quote of one of the richest and most influential media people in Europe, Matthias Döpfner of Axel Springer Publishing, in his op-ed about the future of journalism in his own newspaper, Die Welt. He wrote over 10 years ago that he believes in Riepe's law. Books have not replaced storytelling. Newspapers have not replaced books. Radio has not replaced newspapers, and television has not replaced radio. So it follows that the internet will not replace television or newspapers. We will discuss about that later. In startups, investment and corporate strategy, there is a lot of determinist thinking. So if you look at this curve by Gartner, that is a major consultancy company, it's called the hype cycle, and it shows you how technology is seen to move through time in this pattern, that it is first conceived as an innovation that is triggering a whole field of industry to change, and then comes inflated expectations when it peaks. So people have kind of these messianic expectations that this technology will change the world and will break through. And of course, they never stand up for reality, and so people will be disillusioned. There comes this trough of disillusionment, and then in the end comes the plateau of productivity. And just a few remarks why that actually is some pattern that we see all over the place. I mean, think of blockchain technology, for example, that was so much in the media a few years ago, and people would see that blockchain would kind of save the world. And now everyone says blockchain is just boring, it's just bad. So you see clearly there is this hype cycle. There is a reason behind that, why that exists. So there is a market potential in technology, and people, investors in particular, these analysts are usually quite good in gauging this market potential, in seeing what the technology can achieve economically. For the better or the worse, I mean, it's basically just a question of time, how long it takes. If the slope up to the ceiling of this potential is steeper or less steep. However, this is not how the technology actually is rolled out, because at first, people don't invest that much. So if you have, for example, only one railroad that connects two small towns, as that was the case, for example, in England or in Germany, where the first railroads were built in the 1830s. Railroad is not that a great business. It's just a small business. And so you wouldn't have the money to build more tracks, to buy the land, to lay the tracks on. And these engines are incredibly expensive too. So to invest the money, you first need to earn it. And it takes a while. And the same, of course, is true for the internet. I mean, at first, there were a few lines in the ground that could transport significant amounts of data. But most of the internet traffic, when it took off in the 1990s, was still conveyed over normal telephone lines. That meant that it was very slow and super expensive. You would literally see the money running through while you would be connected, and it would take forever. So it would never send pictures, let alone videos, at the time before, say, 1997 or 2000. But investing all the money made it then possible for the telecommunication companies to provide much more bandwidth with specialized line like optical fiber that would be sufficient for video that we have now. So, and this is what happens then in the middle of the curve. We have this S-shaped curve in the middle. It gets very steep, exponential growth until it hits the ceiling in the end and matures. And if you lay that over each other, first, I mean, is this a kind of disillusionment because, as you see, the line is always under the S curve, it's always lower. So this is your disillusionment that happens, and then in the end, you are always surprised how well the technology does economically. So thinking in these determinist ways, of course, leads to very strong technological narratives like AI. So AI takes away 30 million jobs. How should that actually happen? And of course, it's not AI that takes away the jobs. It is capitalism. I mean, this is as simple as that. I mean, people don't lose jobs. People go from one job to another, maybe. That the jobs are lost. I mean, of course, it has long taken place. I mean, it has been outsourcing to low wage countries. Is wage slavery and sweatshops. This is the reason in Europe and in the US for mass unemployment, in particular for young people. It is just too expensive to employ them when you can have it cheap in the rest of the world. And the same is, of course, true for AI. And in particular, I mean, you see that it's all over. It's not just in America. Here, the BBC has this piece, for example. So automation replaces 1.5 million jobs. That's the Office of Statistics in the UK. So it's the government that tells this frightening story. And you see this kind of sexy robot playing around with something that looks like medication. I mean, of course, no robot, no AI will ever look like that. That's totally silly. And then go a bit deeper, and you see, I mean, of course, I mean, that it is in particular women who will be targeted. And that is just preparing people's minds that technology will be another way of disenfranchising women in labor. Well, so this is technological determinism. And the narrative of progress, which are closely related with communication, particular with communication industries, because communication industries in the 19th and 20th century are the big publishing industries. It is the industry of advertising, it is news, it is the cultural industry. And these industries, of course, have an interest in telling the story that it is not ideology, it is not culture that makes them use technology to foster their monopolies, but that it is technology that drives history, that it is inevitable for history to play out the way it does. So for class, we will look at a specific technology that is dead. It is hardly in use anymore, and it is the semaphore. So the semaphore is a technology of communication that was used early on, and it is the means of conveying signs in an optical way. Very famous is the so-called Chappe telegraph. The Chappe telegraph was introduced in Napoleonic times, so around 1800 in France. And all across France, towards Spain, so from Madrid to Paris, also from Italy to Paris back. So ideally, all across Napoleon's empire were these stations of telegraphy that would tell Napoleon where to send his troops if there is an insurgency. Well, after Napoleon was overthrown in 1815, the telegraph lines stayed in place and would convey totally different news now, which was mainly economical. So the semaphoric communication in the Schabtelegraph plays a major role in one of the nice books of the 19th century, very amusing book. It's The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. So Dumas describes Monte Cristo as this kind of a totally insidious, driven by revenge, a person who comes back in 18 after 14 years, around 1830, comes back into life in France, being insanely rich and using all his money to take revenge. And one of the people he takes revenge of is the former purser of the ship he was on, Danglars. And Danglars has become a rich banker in Paris, so is a man of the stock exchange. And so what Monte Cristo does is he brings a man in the middle attack into one of these telegraph lines between Madrid and Paris, and just bribes one of the people in between to convey a wrong message about an uprising and a revolution taking place in Spain, so that the Spanish stocks would crash on the Paris Stock Exchange. And by that, he would ruin Danglars. So this is a really nice story. I've put the link to the account of Monte Cristo, in particular to the Telegraph story, into the syllabus. So have a look at it. It is a very nice reminder of how communication played a role, how communication was in people's life in the 19th century already, at a time when the electrical telegraph was not yet invented. Yeah, so for the semaphore, one of the most beautiful depictions that I know of is this painting by Georg Scholz. So this painting in 1923 that Scholz made has everything in it. That technologic determinism and the turning of the time after First World War in this new world order of the 1920s has. So you see in the front the light bulbs. So light bulbs, electrical light, of course, is a very strong technological changer. So light bulbs uh, were kind of the key technological invention that would inspire the futurists, these radical progressive thinkers in Italy in the early 20th century, that would inspire fascism as the changing revolutionary force driven by an optimism towards technology. So these light bulbs lie there, but they are not lit. What shines on them is the reflection of a window that you see. So we don't really know what happened. And of course, I mean, in a way, these light bulbs resemble the cactus plants sitting on the windowsill here. Um, they are, of course, smooth, while the cacti are very stingy. And in the background, you see these three semaphores. These are signals that were used on non-electrified rail tracks before light bulbs were available and electricity would replace them with what we have today as signals. So you have these three semaphores mysteriously in the background, and then this veil-like curtain um, uh, um, partly closing the window. So this painting is part of what's called New Realism or Neue Sachlichkeit in the 1920s art is this dealing with industrial progress, with technological change. Um, yeah, feel free to meditate about it when you work on your semaphore assignment, as you shall see. So now we are in the middle of it, in the inventions of communication technology beyond the steam engine and the printing press. So next session, we will look into the electrical side of it and the electronic media that come out of it: telephone, radio, photography, cinema, and television.